Hello guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto becomes the champion of Primordial Devils and got Harem? Part 2. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. Sona did not know what was going on or how she had appeared in such a beautiful temple. But she did know that the orange-haired teen-looking girl was Kurama. Power signatures couldn't lie, and her own ability to sense the world around her was nearly as good as her sister's. Some would even say it was better than that. Sona heard Kurama's welcome and explanation next. "I'm back in his seal. This doesn't look like that." So she then heard Kurama say, "Let us begin now," and watched them take a relaxed and yet at the same time tense stance. A fight. No, a spar. She would at least be able to see some of her new queen's ability. She just didn't know that this fight would make her both fearful and aroused at the fact that he was so powerful. Later, she would need some time alone to deal with the second part of it. Naruto and Kurama then shot forward, almost like lightning, and collided their swords with a loud ringing sound. They had both left brief after images at their starting point, and Sona now knew that they were so fast. Fast enough that even Sasuke's knight would have trouble keeping up. The two continued dashing around the grass field and colliding their blades, all while leaving images that stayed around for 5 to 10 seconds. They even sheathed their blades a few times and used the scabbards as weapons, while also using katas that Sona knew were designed to deal out mass amounts of damage. It continued like this for 30 minutes before Naruto decided to give a lesson with his spar. "You remember the theory of space-time manipulation, Kurama?" he asked as they started colliding blades in a fast-paced wave-like wall. The theory of using not seals, but pure chakra to tear through reality's barriers and send something from point A to point B without moving yourself. Their blades slashed together again before they leapt back, and Kurama paused for a brief moment. She nodded and sheathed her blade. "Hi, sensei. It is theorized by the Niodame Hokage and the Yondaime that you wouldn't need seals to use a type of reverse summoning that is nearly equivalent to their Harassian techniques. They never completed it as both were killed before they could try. Well, one was killed, the other sacrificed himself." She then looked at Naruto. "Why do you ask?" Naruto smirked before sheathing his blade and turning to the left. "Watch, Kura-chan." He then flicked his sword back into the ready position that they had used at the start and focused on the tree he was looking at. A small amount of chakra surrounded the blade and scabbard he held in his left hand. Kurama and even Sona could sense the buildup of such a small amount of power, yet it was also dense. He then quickly drew and slashed his sword forward, yet slowly flourished and sheathed the blade. As the katana clicked into the sheath fully, a number of lines appeared on the tree. Those lines looked like small silver flashes of light, and they appeared in a circular kind of sphere. In a flash, those lines cut through the tree at a speed that not even Kurama could see with her eyes enhanced. This caused her eyebrows to shoot up near her hairline. Sona, who had been watching everything, gulped in fear. Though she also rubbed her thighs together. Naruto then turned back to the two. "It is no longer just a theory. It requires control and power equivalent to the Sanbi's reserves. It is a chakra formula, much like the tailed beast bomb. The ratio, as I have worked out, is 1 in yang and 8 in yin, times the distance by meters, divided by the strength level of harder resistant materials. For flesh, there is no need to divide, as it is a weaker material." He paused and looked back to the tree that was now splinters. That tree, for instance, would have divided the ratio formula by 12, due to its strength and life force. Solid materials like metal, you cannot divide for, as that would make the technique weak. He then turned back to them. "The next biggest factor is your willpower. You have to will a single slash to become multiple and at the same time will them to appear at the target." Kurama nodded, though she was blushing at the display of the technique. "And what are you calling this technique, Naruto-sensei?" she asked almost breathlessly. Naruto looked back to the rekage of the sakura tree he had cut down. "I call it the Judgment's Divide, though I may call it Judgment Cut." He smelled their arousal, though it wasn't something he was used to smelling. He shrugged it off and turned back to them. "I hope this demonstration was enough for now, Sona. But we need to leave, it is nearing 2000 hours," he said before sending both himself and Sona out. Kurama dropped to her knees and finally rubbed her own thighs together. "Damn it, he can get me so hot sometimes. I'll need to take care of this," she thought before removing her hakama and beginning to pleasure herself. Sona's manor. Rear courtyard. Sona opened her eyes, at the same time Naruto opened his own. She felt a mixture of both fear and arousal at what her queen had showed in the seal. She tried to hold the arousal back, as well as the fear, but Naruto saw through the second. "You do not need to fear me, just yet, Sona Citri." She looked at him as he crossed the water, approaching her after he had spoken those words. "I promise that as long as you do not turn into a tyrant, you will never need to fear me." He stopped directly in front of her. She had to look up to see his own eyes, and they showed that she really wouldn't need to fear him. She couldn't help feeling more aroused and hopeful at his next words. I never go back on my word when I say I promise not even the forces of creation will be able to stop me. Universes will break before I go back on a promise. For that is my nindo. He turned to head back to the manor. Also known as my ninja way. It has always been like that. Sona's breath hitched slightly as she could hear the truth in his words. She felt even more waves of heat traveling from both her heart and her stomach. Her eyes widened slightly and she froze for a few minutes. She almost whimpered after that brief time. She then noticed that he had already went inside the manor. She made to follow but almost fell to her knees. Her legs felt like jelly and her lower regions were almost burning with how hot she was feeling. Shit, what is going on with me? She asked herself. After noticing that it wasn't going to stop, she ran for her own room. She didn't know that Naruto had seen her run, as well as the blush on her face. He had been watching from the roof of the manor, and he sighed. Great, I might have made her attracted to me. He then looked up at the sky. You all find this funny, don't you? He sighed again and leapt down to the balcony. He paused in his new room as he heard a moan coming from just a few rooms away. Along with the sounds of a shower running. Well damn. Why didn't I listen to Ikka when she told me girls like the nice ones after they got through puberty? He covered his ears but could still hear Sona's moans for a while. He also now had a label for that strange scent he had smelled earlier. Words are weapons. They said. So be careful how you use them, especially around young women. Damn it, he sighed and turned to head back outside. Sona's manor, master bedroom. 2200 hours. Sona sighed as she laid down in her bed. Her heart was still racing and she was breathing quickly. Her shower had taken longer than she preferred due to the fact that she spent most of it masturbating. She groaned and looked to her left, her gaze traveling up to the visage of the moon through her window. What is wrong with me? She mentally screamed at herself, wondering why she had done something so lewd as pleasuring herself. She didn't even think of such things often. Only once before had she done that. His power, his skill, his words, why did all of that turn me on so hard? She kept gazing at the moon, as it had always helped her calm down. Her thoughts continued, trying to figure out why she suddenly seemed to be so attracted to her queen. They didn't really know each other, so she shouldn't have been so pulled to him. She looked back at everything they had been doing for the past day. She then recalled the matches they had played in chess. She gasped and her eyes widened. It was there, it all started there, she whispered. I created that rule with a vow. She then looked towards the right. Her room was 3 rooms away from Naruto's current room and she could sense that he was outside. She blushed in embarrassment as she remembered that some yakai had sensitive senses. She shook off that thought but kept staring at the same wall. I didn't write that rule using a contract, I vowed. Using mana. She then looked at her right hand. The tingling from her earlier actions was still there and she clenched her fingers. Unbidden, a sudden thought came to her mind. Of her holding Naruto's hand whilst they were making love. Her breath hitched and she shook the thought from her mind's eye. Damn it. Stop that. She almost yelled out loud but kept her mouth quiet. She took a few breaths and turned to look back at the moon. It failed this time to calm her as she imagined him being with her on a moonlit night and treating her like a goddess. She closed her eyes and couldn't help imagining it. She groaned again and her left hand almost began to go to her vagina. She stopped herself and sighed. I won't be getting much sleep tonight. It would be a few days before anyone else realized that Sona Citri was having some trouble. Sona's manor, entrance hall. 20th of June, 8 o'clock. Tsubaki arrived in a circle of magic, waiting to see if anything had happened. She cast her senses around the property and sighed in relief as she felt that Sona was still alive. Your loyalty is commendable. Spoke the voice of Naruto, making her jump and turn around. She saw the young man standing next to the door. I would go so far to say that you would have made a decent kunoichi with how loyal you are to your king. He finished saying as he stared out the window to the left of the main door. Tsubaki was a little tense, but she didn't feel like he would try anything. She watched as he continued to gaze out towards the gate of the property. He sighed and turned to her. His strange eyes gazing directly into hers, appearing to gaze directly into her soul. She felt like he was, and it made her nervous. Do not be so tense. I told Sona that I would work with her and you, so you don't need to be like that. I will tell you what I told her yesterday. I never go back on my word. My words are a binding contract. When I promise something I keep it. He said before turning to head towards the back of the manor's interior. Tsubaki could feel the truth in his words, but she also felt a sense of despair. He was powerful, and she could also see that he was fast. Should anyone she knew in this town try to fight him, there wouldn't even be a funeral. There wouldn't even be a body to bury. She sighed in relief as he disappeared towards the back entrance. She then turned as she heard Sona coming down the stairway. Did Naruto leave? Her king asked. Tsubaki nodded and turned to head towards the kitchen. "Hi Kaichu," he went to the garden area. She said and knew that Sona would either follow her or head to the dining hall. Tsubaki decided to start making breakfast while still keeping an eye out on Naruto. She walked through the manor towards the kitchen and stopped as she felt a buildup of power. She knew that it was chakra as she had seen and felt a few other types of yokai do the exact same thing that he was. She turned to look out the window of the dining hall, as did Sona. They watched as he surrounded himself in a blue fire, though they also noticed a few red and purple wisps of the energy throughout it. Sona blushed as she felt a warm presence from the energy, while Tsubaki shivered. "He's working on trying to replenish his energy. I didn't know that yokai could do that," Sona said in a whisper. Tsubaki turned to her before looking back out as the power level seemed to stop building. They then noticed how another energy seemed to flow into him and help a little with replenishing his energy. It was small though, and Sona noticed his frown after a few moments. Tsubaki didn't really know what he was doing and turned to Sona. Sona sighed and worried at her lower lip. Tsubaki knew that she only did this while in deep thought. "He is a sage, I noticed that last night. But he is also looking at something in the energy." Sona tuned to head off for her office. She would need a few books to see if she could find information about this. "I'll be down in a moment, I need a few texts." Tsubaki nodded before turning to go to the kitchen. Sona's manor, office. Sona sighed as she looked through her collection of books. Grabbing a few on yokai and any she could find about their senjutsu and chakra practices, she turned to look out the windows behind her desk. She saw Naruto, who appeared to be frowning even harder than a few minutes before. The energy he was taking into himself suddenly stopped flowing and he stood while appearing to sigh. She saw him look around, his frown deepening even more. Something doesn't seem right, but the plants around him are doing better. What is it? She asked herself. Her mental question was discarded after a moment when she saw him turn to head back inside. She worried at her bottom lip as she usually did when thinking in private. Though it wasn't for long as she turned to head back to the dining hall. She looked to her watch while using a bit of her magic to have the books follow her. Her watch was reading just a few moments from 10 after 0800. She didn't even notice that she had reached the dining hall a minute later as she was still going through heavy thought. She heard the doors leading outside open but didn't even look up to see Naruto enter. She placed her books on the table and sat to open one of the 5 she had grabbed. The smell of breakfast wouldn't hit her for a few minutes, but Naruto's nose twitched as he looked at her. He stayed silent as the smell of frying eggs hit his nostrils. As well as bacon and a few other scents. His eyes narrowed and turned to the front area of the manor. His gaze appeared to reach out beyond the walls and even beyond the boundaries of the property. "We will have some visitors soon, Sona." His words broke her trance and she turned to look at his face. She nodded and turned back to the only volume of text she had on chakra. "We'll have Tsubaki's friend over, she wants to join the peerage and become a devil," she said and kept reading. She stopped when he scoffed and turned to look at him again. "If you were speaking about an engine, then I am afraid I wasn't talking about that. There is a group of mana signatures approaching from the mountains. Their energies don't appear friendly." His voice sounded out, he then turned to her. "I'd estimate about 38 hours before they arrive." Sona's eyebrow arched as she looked into his eyes. "You can sense them when they are so far away." At his nod, she turned back to the book. She then heard Tsubaki walking into the dining hall and smelled the food. She didn't think about much else, but did plan to test her new queen with whatever was approaching. Sona's manor, front courtyard. An hour later. Naruto stood on the roof of Sona's mansion, watching the road as vehicles passed by. He made sure that none could see him by bending the light around him with mana. He used to sigh at the fact that illusions were nearly impossible for him with chakra, though his own experiments had yielded some progress. "It's easier now that I have a version of Sasuke's eyes, but I'm more comfortable using mana for it." He watched as more vehicles passed with this thought. He also noticed that Tsubaki had left a few minutes before. He sensed her and a human approaching. He sighed as he saw them walk around the corner from the southeast. "I suppose that she would need more followers. At least she seems to be giving them a choice." He waited for them to reach the gate and noticed Sona heading for it from the front door. As Sona arrived at the gate, he leapt. As silent as he was, he knew that they would notice the dust from his landing. He quickly dissolved the illusion around himself and fell the last 40 feet. His landing was silent, but his appearance startled Tsubaki and the girl she was leading. He stood slowly as Sona turned to him. "Are you going to be spending most of your time up there?" Sona asked him before turning back to the other two. "Welcome, Momo. I trust that your trip here was pleasant." She didn't pay attention when Naruto scoffed at the question she had asked, but did notice that his gaze was on the new arrival. Momo was still staring at the blonde, but nodded at Sona. Sona smiled lightly. "That is good. Before we begin, I would like to introduce to you my second in command." My queen peace, Naruto Uzumaki. She then turned to head back into the manor. Please, follow me. We will continue in my office. Tsubaki noticed that her king was a little out of it at the moment, but she didn't know what could have caused Sona's seemingly negligence to paying attention. Are you alright, Kaichu? She asked. Sona hummed and looked back to her. Hi. Just a little tired. I had to make sure everything was ready for today. Sona then turned back and continued to lead them inside. Naruto stopped before reaching the front door and decided to use the shunshin to get there first. Sona sighed while Momo gasped at how he disappeared. Tsubaki could sense that it wasn't a sigh of frustration, however, she could feel the Citri was a bit relieved and at the same time, confused. What is going on? Sona doesn't seem to be here fully. She asked herself while following the girl with Momo. It took them a few minutes to walk from the first floor entryway to Sona's office on the second floor, and when they arrived they found Naruto near Sona's desk. He stood as still as a statue near the open window to their left while facing him, he had a cigarette light and was inhaling from it. Sona smiled slightly as the scent washed over them. It smells nice, she absently thought as she moved to her chair. She would later wonder why she thought that, but it wasn't an issue for that moment. Now then, she said as she sat in her chair, I hope you will come away with some decent knowledge at least. Even if you do not accept becoming a devil, you will still be a friend of Tsubaki's, and I will at least call you friend as well. She then motioned for Momo to take a seat. I also hope that you will at least consider everything carefully, even the consequences that could pop up with others in this town. There are many perks for being turned, however, there are also a few consequences. She then started to explain to Momo about the devil race. Naruto watched silently and also learned a few more things from Sona's words. Both about the devil race and of Sona herself. An hour later. Sona sighed in relief, having just turned Momo and getting the girl set up for being her second bishop piece. She had noticed that Naruto watched a ritual with an empipetical gaze and had even summoned a notebook to write in. Tsubaki had watched him during the ritual and caught a glance of what he was writing. His notes were detailed about the ritual, even putting side notes on the magical process. Tsubaki had let her know and she would talk with him about it. Most didn't think to question or actually think about the magical process of changing races. She knew that only a Juka Beelzebub could say more about it, but even he didn't really take the time to fully research what happens in the resurrection phase. He seems to have a scholarly mentality when it comes to magic. I wonder what type of conversations could come to us. Sona thought as she looked at the clock in her office. It was close to the time that her mother would appear, though she thought it wouldn't be for another hour. That was intriguing, though I'd have to see another ritual to cement the facts of such a ritual. She heard Naruto say and turned to see him flipping a few of the pages in his notebook. You seem to have a fascination with magic, it is good to see someone taking time to research things that most take for granted. She replied, causing him to turn his gaze to her. There are many reasons that most do not question such things. In Anbu, we are taught to take facts with a pound of salt when said facts are only given by word of mouth. He responded after a few minutes. The most important words for any critical thinker are who, what, where, when, why, and how. Most do not ask those 6 questions as they are not able to properly think. He finished, turning his gaze back to his notes. Most people either cannot or just do not question what is happening around them. They are like sheep in that regard, and many also take on the guise of a parrot. Saying things that have already been said just to make them sound intelligent. I do no such thing. I always question what is happening, I always question everything around me so that I may understand just why they are happening. He said before walking to the chair in front of her desk. Sona's lips turned upward slightly, a small smile, though he noticed it was a true one. It pulled at him a little and he felt his breath catch. That is a good way of living. Questioning what is going on around you are right that most do not properly think. She said and then looked into his eyes. I hope that you never let go of that type of personality. Naruto nodded and decided to place the notebook before her. I'm not sure if you know what happens during that ritual, but this is what I saw, though I will have to see another ritual to be certain. Sona took the book and opened it. Her eyes widened after a few minutes of reading it and her gaze turned back to his eyes. If this is true then we'll have to get in touch with Beelzebub-sama. He is the one that made the evil pieces, so he might know more, but then again, I can't be certain. He has so many projects going on that he might not have been able to fully research or test what happens. Naruto nodded, though motioned her to keep the notebook. He made a copy of it that he placed in his personal pocket dimension and stood up. He moved to her right as another magic circle appeared a few feet behind the chair he had just vacated. Sotan! Came the shout of Seraphol Leviathan as she appeared with their mother. The Leviathan then leapt over the desk to hug her sister, but was sent flying the other direction by a backhand from Naruto. The resulting thud was loud, as was the groan from said Satan. Please do not do that again. Naruto spoke while rubbing his left fox ear. The other two gazed at him with wide eyes, and Sona's mouth was open slightly. There was another groan from the still stunned Leviathan, and Sona turned to the body of her sister. She almost laughed at the sight of diplomatic Satan before turning to her mother. "You're early, Kasan," she said and turned back to Seraphil. "One-sama, please keep in mind that my new queen has sensitive ears." She then blushed slightly, remembering what she did the night before. Damn it. That means he heard me. She would have to set up some sound barriers soon. Especially if it keeps happening, I need to figure out what's going on. Her thoughts made Naruto look at her slightly before he turned back to look at Sona's mother. She didn't know that he could read her surface thoughts every now and then. It was a skill he picked up after his sage training. A type of mental skill he had discreetly had clones research through a few of his tomes on magic, while Killer Bee was supposedly helping him tame Kurama's power. "We played those parts well, didn't we?" he had asked her before Sasuke caught up with him. "It is good to see you, my dear daughter," spoke the other woman after a few minutes of reining in her shock at the blonde man's actions. This brought Naruto's attention to her, and he had to say that they looked alike. Though he would have sworn that she was a sister with a different hair and eye color. After Naruto looked her over for a moment, he turned his attention to the now standing Leviathan. "Ow, did you have to hit me so hard?" she asked as she approached the desk. Naruto's eyebrow twitched, and he sighed. "Did you have to be so loud in your greeting, as well as jumping over the desk when I have no idea on who you are? I am a guardian of Sona for now, and I couldn't be too sure on your intentions whilst dealing with my ear almost exploding," he asked in a monotonous deadpan tone. Seraphil rubbed the back of her head sheepishly and blushed slightly. Amelia also blushed at the sound of his voice and at the power he seemed to throw out with it. She could tell that he was a leader and that only those strong enough could hold such positions outside of the mundane world. "And you must be the new queen of my daughter's peerage. I am Amelia Citri, it is a pleasure to meet you." Sona's mother spoke before walking over to shake his hand. As she grasped hands with him, her eyes widened at the sense of power rolling off of him. "Uzumaki Naruto, I hope we can get along, Citri-san," he replied, noticing her surprise at the power he was unconsciously throwing out. A contact sensor, those are rare, he thought, remembering one of his tomes giving a small bit of information on that type of sensor. They could sense normally, though if they made physical contact, they could sense everything about a body. "And I am magical girl Leviathan," Seraphil said while waving at him. She then saw her mother and sister glare at her. "Seraphil Leviathan, formerly Citri, though never married. I am Sotan's elder sister," she corrected herself. "Also known as the diplomatic Satan of foreign affairs." Naruto sighed before also offering his hand. "A pleasure, just please don't scream so loud again." He then returned to Sona's side. She rubbed the back of her head again and he finally got a good look at her outfit. He sighed again before taking note of Amelia's dress. It was a royal blue and had a few tree images on the stomach, reaching down to her knees and had a smooth texture. It reached up to cover her shoulders before going on down the back. He couldn't see it, but the back had an image of a great tree. Her arms were bare, except for the elbow-length royal blue gloves. She wore black shoes that were formal, with dark green leggings that disappeared up her dress. The shoes were not high-heeled, and he could tell they were made for fast movement. Her eyes were looking at Sona, and the solid green of them reminded him of emeralds. Her deep blue hair was tied in a ponytail and reached the middle of her back. He could tell it was natural, as his eyes finished rolling over her again. "It is good to see you, Kasan, One-sama. I will have Tsubaki bring us tea when she returns," Sona said before looking to Naruto. He had scoffed slightly and summoned a tea kettle from his personal pocket dimension. "No need, I have tea already. Preferred brand already made," he said as he placed the kettle on the desk and summoned 3 cups for them to drink with. He then pulled a cup of coffee from his pocket dimension as well. "Milk and 4 spoons of sugar already added." "I get the feeling that you abuse pocket dimensions, don't you, Naruto?" Sona asked. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. Mallet space was designed to be abusively used to store things inside of it. Mages have long abused it before I was born, what is one more user abusing it when there have already been so many others? He spoke, making 2 of the 3 nod. "Don't talk about mallet space. That's breaking the 4th wall," Seraphil nearly shouted. Naruto gazed into her eyes and deadpanned. "There is no 4th wall. I disproved that when I was 9. He then pulled a notebook out of his space, as well as a vial that held a silvery smoke-like string in it. "My notes and memory of that day." He also pulled a pensieve out. Seraphil stared at the objects with a sweat drop rolling down her forehead. "How the hell do you have a memory viewer?" she asked, turning her eyes back to his. "I made it and it is actually called a pensieve." He spoke in a monotone. This made the other 3 gape at him, as most magicians never went into enchanting at such a level. Only the great Mephistophels of the underworld still actively used enchanting and rune crafting skills. Ajuka Beelzebub only used them for making the evil pieces and a few other projects, but not so actively. Does it work? Sona asked after regaining her composure. Naruto nodded and placed it on the desk. Though he did have to levitate it there as he still had his hands full. Taking a sip of his coffee, he responded. Hi, it works. One of 13 working models I've made. Since I only had tomes of how to make them, I had to use the trial and error approach with over 30 of them failing. Sona's eyes gleamed a little. No wonder you pick up knowledge so fast, you have to be a prodigy. She whispered, though they could all hear it. She had noticed this after showing him a few things about the world. His eyes saw nearly everything, and he could remember it all as well. Naruto sighed, taking another sip of his coffee. My IQ was nearly 200, but I prefer to work more than the standard genius. There were only 2 people I know of that broke the 200 line, my friend Shikamaru and his father. They were the laziest geniuses that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. He sighed and took another sip of coffee. Though I did have to play the role of an idiot with an IQ of below average. Sona gazed at him, as did the others, watching as his eyes seemed to glaze over in memories. It would be a few minutes before he returned from it, so Amelia turned back to look at the objects he had summoned. She then looked at her youngest daughter. So, Sona-chan, what are your plans for this year? Amelia asked. The Cult Research Clubroom, 11:30. Koneko Taoju sat on the couch she preferred to sit on, munching on a few cookies while still reading the book that Naruto had given her. Her focus was on the book so much that she forgot to leave her ears and tail hidden. Riaz watched as Koneko's eyes slowly moved, reading the book and causing a slight frown to appear across the Nikasho's face. This made the Gremory heiress feel a small amount of worry as Koneko's tail twitched in the same way a cat would show annoyance. Koneko? Riaz asked, knowing that the girl would only pay enough attention to get the gist of a conversation. Are you alright? Koneko didn't respond for a few minutes. She finished the chapter she was reading before turning to stare at her king. Fine. She responded in one word before turning back to the book. Riaz winced at the tone as she felt like it was colder than usual. Okay, she's a little angry. She thought and turned as the door opened. Akeno stepped inside and gave her a folder filled with papers from her brother and carried the symbol of Lucifer on the folder. After opening the folder and reading a few key pieces from the first page, she sighed. Damn, we can't do anything about this. Sona will have to deal with it. She then continued to read while mumbling to herself. She stopped after reading a bit of the last page, her face going pale. Akeno, she turned to the Halfallen. We need to get a hold of Sona. We may not have any control in Kuo after this. Akeno narrowed her eyes slightly in a questioning gaze, but nodded and crafted a spell circle to get a hold of Tsubaki. Riaz turned back to Koneko as the younger teen made a noise that sounded like a whimper. The young girl seemed to sweat slightly and her eyes were widened as she started another page. Riaz frowned even more than she usually did when dealing with things that concerned her. She was still focused on her contract with Riser, but she did worry more about her peerage than that issue. What is it, Koneko? She asked the young girl. The white-haired Nekashu didn't answer, and after a few minutes of the young girl staring at the same page, Riaz sighed. I'll have to read that book if it's causing her to be unresponsive, then I need to know. She nodded after that thought, planning to either swipe the book later or make a copy. Sona's Manor, 1600 hours. Tsubaki walked into Sona's office after knocking on the door. Kaichu, Momo has moved into the room at the beginning of the hall. She said, before turning to Sona's mother. Good afternoon, Lady Citri. Leviathan Sama. The three looked to her, while the two ladies nodded to Tsubaki. Sona thanked her bishop. Arigato Tsubaki. I trust that it wasn't a problem. Tsubaki nodded to her king. Hi Kaichu, no problem with that. However, Akeno contacted me not too long ago. Riaz needs to speak with you, and it is urgent. Sona nodded, before looking to her sister, who giggled. Her eyebrow twitched slightly, before she sighed. What is it, Ni-sama? Serafol rubbed the back of her head and smiled sheepishly before answering. I may have conned Surziches into giving you complete control over Kuo. Her eyes looked up to the right of Sona, a habit she had whenever she was embarrassed about something she did. In exchange you will have to keep Riser Phoenix from entering the area while Riatan is here. She spoke those last words a bit lowly, as though it was an embarrassing issue. Sona stared at her sister for a moment or two and then sighed again. Please tell me you didn't mention my queen to him. Sona didn't ask, and Serafol's head dropped slightly. Maybe. The Leviathan replied. I might have mentioned that he could possibly help Riatan's rook with some things, and I might have gone off on a small tangent to Serzi about his power levels. Her voice fell lower until it was an embarrassed whisper at the end. Sona's eyebrow twitched again. Serafol, I love you, my dear sister, but I must remind you. Do not bargain with anyone when it concerns me. Sona said in a cold tone. They all heard a scoffing chuckle from above them and looked up at the high ceiling. Naruto sat upside down, while only wearing his Anbu outfit. His Haori was off in his room for the moment and he had a sword strapped to his back. Another rested on his left hip. It actually sounds like a good deal. Gaining complete control over the town, while only needing to help keep a certain individual away and helping another with a few things. I will have to ask about which of them was the rook though. His voice sounded out, as though he were bored. Yet it still made Sona blush, and Serafal pouted at the sound. Why must you sound so tempting? The Leviathan mumbled. Naruto smirked and opened his eyes while looking at Serafal. I've been told that my voice is naught but a weapon of seduction. Those words were said by a few of my subordinates, of the female gender even. Serafal grumbled, while Sona sighed. Kiba might have a rival in terms of fangirls now. The younger of the two said. Naruto shrugged after dropping down from the roof. I don't know who Kiba is, but I can only presume that he could have an army of girls at his beckoning. I don't plan on having the same. He said, and then turned to Tsubaki. Was any of the two I met the one that would need my aid? He asked her. Tsubaki nodded. Hi, the only rook that Rias has. The one you gave that book to. She said, before turning back to her king. Shall I schedule a meeting soon, Kaichu? Sona glared at her sister for a moment before turning her gaze to Tsubaki. Hi, we will meet in her clubroom. Tomorrow afternoon. Tsubaki nodded and then turned to leave. I will make sure of it, Kaichu. She said as the door closed behind her. Sona then turned her gaze to Naruto. This meeting may not go over well. Rias can hold a grudge, and if she knows that her brother is the one to sell out her stock in this town, she sighed and closed her eyes. We may have to find some way to calm her. She is not as powerful as Surzich's Lucifer, but her own power can easily level a few miles. She explained to the blonde. He hummed and thought for a few moments, then he responded. I could seal away all mana use in the area we will meet with them. Her power is chaotically large, but it still follows the common rules of mana. Only a primordial, or even a primal deity, is able to use mana without following the rules. He then turned his gaze out of the window. They are the only beings that my usual sealing methods do not affect. His eyebrow twitched as his gaze took in the closest mountain near Kuo. Our company is picking up the pace, Sona. They'll be here by midnight. Sona nodded after she stretched her own senses out. She turned to her mother and sister. This will be a good test for you, Naruto. I hope you won't mind us watching how you deal with them. It will allow me to see just what you are capable of. Amelia and Serafo looked towards each other. They nodded and turned back to Sona. Amelia spoke first. Hi, we would like to see if you are as skilled as you are powerful. It would be nice to know that you can protect Sona, who you are contracted to marry now. Serafo glared at Naruto before speaking. Indeed. Just know, young man, I don't care how powerful you are. If you hurt Sotan, I will destroy you. The last part of the threat was said a bit faster than normal speech, but they all knew what she was saying. Naruto smiled slightly, while his gaze still looked out the window. I can respect that sentiment. Maybe I can find a few new precious ones here. He then turned to them, though he wiped the small smile from his face. You don't need to worry about that. He said, before turning back to the window. Abandoned Church of Kuo, 1930. On the last row of pews, within the abandoned and derelict church, sat a young girl. Her hair was long and tied into a ponytail and blacker than the night sky. Her eyes were just as black and she seemed to stare out at the altar with a cold look of apathy. She sighed before turned her eyes to the left. Watching as another person sat down on the pew across the aisle. The new person was female and had hair that was nearly as black as her own. The eyes of this new one were reddish purple and were gazing just as coldly at the altar. The young-looking girl sighed as she saw the outfit, a two-piece BDSM-styled bikini with high-reaching high-heeled boots. You called, Lady Ophis. I am here. Came the voice of the newly sat young woman. Ophis hummed, yet remained silent for a little while. Still staring at the ruined altar, knowing that her current visitor would wait for her to speak. I have a champion now, Rainer. Though he does not yet know it, he will be the one to help stop the true apocalypse. Her words came out slow and seemed cold. The young woman, who was named Rainer, nodded. I take it that you would like me to watch over your champion. Is this correct, Ophis-sama? She asked, turning to the being that could easily destroy the earth. Ophis nodded and stood, turning to Rainer. Yes, I would like for you to keep an eye out on him. His name is Naruto Uzumaki and he is a Kikbi no Kitsune. Though he has been resurrected as a devil by Sona Citri. She then turned to leave, but continued speaking. Do not test him. He is capable of fighting both myself and the Great Red. Be sure to keep me informed of what is happening both here and in the Grigori. Rainer nodded, but sighed after Ophis fully left. She turned her gaze back to the altar after watching her true leader leave. I suppose the plans are changing, Azazel, and even Kakabiel would like to have this information. Though they are likely to know soon, she sighed again after speaking and then turned her eyes upwards into the rotting rafters of the church. She formed a magicircle and left after 30 minutes of staring into the darkened area of the ceiling. Sona's manor, entryway, 2300 hours. Naruto waited by the front door, with his eyes closed and arms crossed. He had sensed two other beings in town earlier, and one was slightly familiar. The other was far too weak to be of a concern in a fight, but he didn't know if the other one would try anything whilst they slept. Paranoid I may be, but still paranoia has been the best friend of many strong shinobi. He sighed after that thought and continued waiting. He changed his outfit earlier, deciding to wear something even darker and more modern than his typical Anbu gear. He now wore black cargo pants with boots that were just as dark, a belted waist cape that was just as black to cover his 9 tails. The cape held a dark crimson fox's head, resting right over the right leg. His left leg was only partially covered in the front and had the kanji for honor just below the waist. His shirt was now a black muscle shirt with a long left sleeve covering his left arm, while the right was sleeveless. The neckline of the shirt was extended to his chin and held a V-line that reached just above the middle of his chest. Both arms had black bracers on them to protect his lower arms. His pants hid the black metal plates to protect his shins, and his shirt hid a specialized mesh material to protect his torso. On the belt holding his cape, he had a short sword that was double-edged resting from the right hip on the back side of the belt. He placed it there to grab in a reverse grapple style. On his left hip sat a black pouch that was filled with shinobi gear. Kunai, shuriken, smoke bombs, and senbon. His back held a katana, the hilt resting just behind his right shoulder. The weapons were under a minor illusion, so as not to be seen by normal eyes. Not even a seraph would be able to see them, though it had to have seals placed to do so. His control may be light years better than what he had to act with on his final mission, but chakra-based illusions were still a bit of a pain for him. He also thought of carrying a few sealing scrolls to go in the chest belt that was a dark crimson X over his chest, but decided against it. He sighed as the time ticked slowly to midnight. They would leave about 5 minutes before, though Sona had wanted to leave a bit earlier than that. He had pushed for only 5 minutes, as he could lay traps faster than she would think possible for most. It was Amelia that had actually gotten Sona to listen, though he didn't really care about that too much. You do know that this will be far too easy, right Naruto-kun? Kurama asked through the mental connection she held with him. Naruto sighed and responded out loud. Hi, but it is needed for them to see firsthand how good I am. Kurama hummed in agreement but didn't want to wait patiently for this test to start. True, but I still think it's a waste of time. Naruto chuckled and nodded. Hi, though you believe that taking out any who are weak is nothing but a waste. He then went silent and turned his head to the left. Opening his eyes, he spied the newest member of Sona's peerage trying to subtly spy on him from the parlor room. When Momo noticed he had caught her, she eeped before quickly hiding away behind the wall. This made his right eyebrow raise up and silently chuckle again. Doesn't that remind you of someone, Kura-chan? He mentally asked the kitsune that was sealed in him. Her chuckle was heard, though she did not say anything. She also cut the connection so that her voice wouldn't be heard by him for a little while. He wouldn't know that she was getting jealous of the fact that other females were paying attention to him for quite some time. He closed his eyes again and would keep an ear out for when the other three would arrive. He cast his thoughts to what he knew of the mana arts and decided that he would need to study more about them. Along with learning of this world's background, I'll be reading a lot in the next few months. He sighed as that thought went through his head. He didn't notice that Sona was watching him from the top of the stairs or that she was seeing how calm his mana was. She was silent and also chewing on her bottom lip in a type of thinking gesture. Her thoughts were not only on the small test he would be taking in a while, but were also on her oath about that rule she had made. Her blush was small, almost unnoticeable. It would have increased if she started thinking about everything she had seen from the other night, from when she was healing him. She was quite a bit more prudish than Ria's, that was a fact that many in the Gremory group knew, but she wasn't exactly against nudity in a private setting. She shook her head to get rid of thoughts that would make her blush even more, so as not to be grilled about it by her mother. Though if Seraphil asked, she would admit he was impressive in the nude. She shook such thoughts from her head again and turned to walk back to her office. She felt that it would be best to keep her mind busy with other things. They still had 40 minutes before they would leave. Naruto opened his eyes, exactly 38 minutes later. He sensed Sona, Seraphil, and Amelia as they walked down the stairs. Their footsteps were more quiet than usual due to the carpet they stepped on. His ears still twitched though, and he could have sworn that he could hear a fly buzzing a few hundred yards away. He cast his eyes upwards to see them step off of the stairs. He stood up from his leaning against the wall and moved forward. From his front right pocket he pulled out a pair of crimson shades and placed them on. He also pulled out his half-empty pack of cigarettes, took one and placed it in his mouth. He would wait to light it, as teleporting with a combustible substance lit up would be too hazardous. As the three ladies approached, he turned his eyes to the left and spoke. You might as well allow them to follow Sona, they could learn a few things by watching. His voice still sounded bored, and his stance appeared lazy. At least it did to a normal person, or a newbie. Sona could tell that his stance was a ruse, though she got the feeling that he would be bored with this test. I suppose, you may be correct about that, she said, before turning to her right. Tsubaki, Momo, come. She tersely commanded. Momo stepped out from the parlor, she hadn't left that room for a little while. She nodded and stepped forth to join the group. She didn't know what was going on, but figured she would at least learn something about being a devil. Tsubaki leapt down from the second story, she then landed right behind Sona's left shoulder and bowed her head slightly. Hi, Kaichu. Sona turned back to Naruto, while Seraphal's eyes glistened in slight interest. The Leviathan knew they were there, but their power was far too small to pay much attention to with her senses. Sona narrowed her eyes, feeling a small chill run down her spine. As well as a small amount of curious excitement. Lead the way, Naruto. She said, and locked him in her sense before crafting a teleportation circle. The rest saw him step back into the shadows near the door. For a brief second, all they saw was the light reflecting from his sunglasses, before even those disappeared. Seraphil gaped, as he truly seemed to disappear. She couldn't even sense him anymore and was about to ask what happened. The others were about to as well, but they were pulled through the circle to their destination before any could say a word. The western woods of Kuo, 2355. The Ophis faded into existence, sitting on a tree branch, as the magic circle of the Citri family appeared below her. From the circle's light, she saw Sona, Tsubaki, Seraphil, Amelia, and a new devil appear. She smirked slightly, knowing that Naruto had appeared here a few seconds before. She watched as he approached the group, appearing to step straight out of the shadows of the tree across from them. She also knew that he had already laid traps. Let me give you a bit more of a challenge, my champion, she smirked and released a small amount of her power. She placed a small tear in the fabric of dimensions, but would wait to open it until after he had dealt with the grunts. She knew he had sensed her presence and the small rip. She knew his eyes were on her the moment she arrived and decided to wave at him slightly. She heard him scoff and mentally grinned at the sound. Sona spoke while stepping forth a few feet. I hope you are prepared, Naruto. Please keep in mind that when they arrive I will place a barrier around the battlefield. This will keep the battle in an alternate dimension, a pocket space if you will. She turned back to give Seraphil a look. This will keep the outside world from seeing and feeling anything that goes on here, and it will keep the damage from affecting the physical world. Seraphil Ni-sama will supply the power necessary for the barrier to keep it all in this place. Naruto hummed, understanding what she was saying, but knew that Ophis would have to help with that. Let us see if you are as good as the legends claim, Ouroboros. He then turned away from them, facing the west. Sona raised an eyebrow and looked around. Are you going to play some traps? She asked, not seeing anything that could indicate a trap of any kind. She heard him chuckle lowly and turned her eyes to him. His response was almost a whisper, but she heard it clearly. Already done. She narrowed her eyes and looked around again. Not seeing anything, she decided to open her senses more. She couldn't really feel much in the way of mana, but she did sense something was amiss. She looked around again and saw a few glowing marks on many of the trees. She only saw this by using her mana with her eyes, and her eyebrows furrowed slightly. The marks were symbols that she had never seen before and seemed to be holding something back. Almost like mines. She realized after a few seconds. She cast her gaze back to him and nodded before stepping back. They are here. He spoke after a minute. Sona nodded and turned to her sister, who was already casting a barrier around the area. It was 1 square kilometer in circumference, and most of the group could sense 20 new creatures in the area. Momo could not feel it yet, but Naruto sighed only 20, damn alerted her to the fact that they were being watched. Naruto pulled his katana from its scabbard as a beast leapt out of the tree line. It was monstrous in the fact that it appeared like a medium-sized chimera. It had the body of a scaled lion, with large bat-like wings. A tail that looked more like an alligator's with spikes on the end and protrusions sticking out of its hind legs. The head, however, made Momo gape and blush. It was a completely naked man, from the knees up. The grin on the man's face was far too insane for anyone to look at properly. His beak was erect yet looked as sickeningly black and was leaking a green fluid. I didn't need to see that. Naruto spoke lowly and sighed again. After his words were spoken, the other 19 appeared as well. Each was grotesque and looked like things that even a mother would not be able to love. The first laughed after gazing at them all. Looky here guys. We got grub. And some entertainment. He cackled before an earth spike shot up through his skull. The others stopped laughing as they watched their leader die. It was quiet for a moment before Naruto spoke again. One down, you all are next. He said, before raising his left hand in a half-tiger hand seal. He rushed forward, as soon as his chakra activated the other 5 seals he had placed in the area. There were 3 explosions, and 2 puffs of smoke that came from the seals. The 3 closest exploded in fire, lightning, and magma, taking out 11 of the creatures in the middle. 2 more fell from being impaled by 2 other earth spikes. The last 6 tried to turn and rush him, but he had already appeared behind 2 of them and cut them in half with his sword. He was bored, these things were nearly as bad as the armies of bandits he had already killed by the age of 14. So many corpses, how many more will I add to my resume? He mentally asked himself before deciding to tone it down a bit. He at least wanted to get a better challenge out of this. He also wanted to at least show his current audience that his skill was equal to his power. It had only taken a few seconds for Sona to realize that 16 of the strays were dead before they could really move, or at least try to. Her eyes widened slightly when she noticed Naruto was shifting to a lower gear and started to showcase his skill. She watched as he danced around the 4 strays, leaving small nicks or taking a limb. It was still fast enough to be impressive, better than even Ria's Knight, but she could keep up with it now. He wasn't using the style she had seen the night before, but she could at least see it was designed to weaken opponents by leaving small wounds while taking 1 or 2 limbs for maximum effect. He had reversed the grip on his katana, and although it was hard to notice, she could see his left hand clenched in a fist while shaking it lightly. She checked it using her senses and realized that he was releasing small amounts of power through it to stabilize his sword arm. The power wasn't very familiar, but she could tell that it was necessary for him to live. Is that his chakra? I thought chakra was purely spiritual, I'll have to research this. She mentally told herself as Naruto took one of the stray's heads from its shoulders. She felt something more than just spiritual energy coming from him now that she was looking at him while using her own mana sense. Only 3 left and they're as slow as a standard freshly promoted Chunin. Naruto sighed after that thought while dodging a strike from his left by the one who looked like a part lizard with bat-like wings and a naked female. He took the same arm that attacked him from the beast and threw it into the chest of the wolf and serpent-looking male. He then swirled around the female while decapitating her and paused to stare at the last opponent. It was part horse, part cat, and part female human. No part devil. Most of these things may have been human once. He then straightened his stance and stared directly into the creature's eyes. You are all that is left. Will you fight your fate or will you give in? He spoke, and all remaining in the clearing shivered at the coldness his voice portrayed. Ophis and Sona didn't shiver in fear though. Ophis didn't understand what her body was doing, but she felt a heat bubble up in her chest and abdomen. She would try to figure it out later, but for now, she wanted to see how her champion would destroy the beast. Sona knew exactly what was happening with her and blushed even more fiercely than she normally did when he spoke. Damn it, that tone reminds me of Nisama's diamond dust spell. Please tell me he won't use it much, otherwise I might try bringing him to my bed faster than is proper. Her thoughts made her blush even more, but she spotted him shift his stance again. He sheathed his blade but pulled the scabbard to his left hand. Shifting his left foot backward slightly, he then placed his right hand on the handle of his sword. The blade was facing the sky in the scabbard and he flicked it out only slightly. The beast roared in defiance and lunged to try and hit him. It never made it the rest of the 20 feet between itself and his own position. He quickly sliced the blade through the air before flourishing and then quickly sheathing the blade. The beast stopped as his attack had already connected, his hand keeping the blade from fully being sheathed. He spoke once more. May you be judged for all that you have done. Accept your demise and go in peace. He then sheathed the blade fully. All but Sona wondered what had happened before the creature fell into a few hundred pieces, being torn apart by flashes of silver that streaked through it from multiple angles and directions. The blood spray from the beast painted the surrounding 10 feet from it and the gore left behind fell in a way that one would think a child had just destroyed a block castle. Amelia, Seraphol, Tsubaki and Momo all gasped in slight amazement. As well as fear, though Seraphol started to feel like the temperature was rising. He then turned and slowly strolled towards them after placing the sheath of his katana back over his shoulder. His eyes glowed eerily in the moonlight and the shadows casted on his face from his hair made it appear as though an angry god had just cast his judgment. Ophis smirked, though she felt that he'd get stronger. She decided to cancel the summoning for a stronger opponent and just gazed at the blonde in slight wonder. For he had done something with that technique to create a sphere of compressed void power and cast his sword slice through it while multiplying the number of slices. You really do look like a devil right now, Naruto-kun. As well as a god. I hope to see more soon. She thought before disappearing without making a sound to tell that she had been there. She also failed to notice that she had called his name with an affectionate suffix. Sona's office 045, 21st of June. Sona sighed as she looked through the document that Seraphol had given her. It was marked with the symbol of House Lucifer, so it was official. I now own Kuo, she sighed again, as her thoughts turned back to the small fight she had seen less than 40 minutes before. No, it was a massacre. And his cold tone, she thought, as another blush grafted to her cheeks. Her right hand moved to her stomach and then started moving lower. She stopped herself after realizing what she was doing. Damn it. Stop that. She mentally commanded herself and tried to shift her mind to something else. Her thoughts were derailed by her mother's voice. You're getting worked up about something, dear. Mind telling me what it is? Amelia watched as her youngest daughter fidgeted slightly. She was still waiting for the young lady to tell her what was wrong. It would take a few moments, as she knew that both of her daughters had their own ways of explaining things. She sat before Sona's desk, in front of the girl, so that she wouldn't startle her. Sona sighed after a minute and then proceeded to explain how she felt. When I made that rule about the marriage contract, I didn't just put it as a written rule. She fidgeted a little more and drew her eyes to the desk. I made a magical vow, she said, which drew a gasp from Amelia. What kind of vow? Amelia asked, after letting that sink into her mind. Sona blushed slightly, before replying. I vowed that even if the one who beat me in chess at least 3 times, without fluking or getting lucky, that even if he was weak, I would find him attractive. Amelia hummed in thought and replied. And now, you know that the one who beat you is easily above Lord Lucifer in power. She poured herself a cup of tea from the kettle that Naruto had left there. Sona nodded, before continuing. And that he is skilled enough in combat. But, what really got me tonight, was his tone. It was cold and promised certain death to those strays. It lit a fire inside of me, much like Nisama's diamond dust spell. Amelia chuckled slightly. The both of you always had a strange appreciation for ice magic. Sona sighed and looked down at her desk. You know why? We are too vested in our intelligence to be concerned with social interactions or feeling the warmth of such things. Even Nisama is like that, despite her personality quirks. Sona chuckled after saying that and turned her eyes back up. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she saw another being in the shadows by the door. Amelia saw her eyes narrow and turned to look at what Sona was looking at. She didn't see anything but felt like they were being watched. What do you see, Sona? She asked after a moment. Sona harumphed and responded while still looking into the shadows. Have you ever heard of creatures called shades? The creature seemed to disappear after she asked that. Amelia turned back to Sona and fidgeted. Hi, I have. Why? Sona sighed and turned back to her mother. Naruto has a contract with Limbo. He can summon them for use in spying and gathering intel. He can apparently summon them as guards as well. Amelia seemed to be paralyzed for a moment, her eyes widened and her breath hitched. You are certain? She asked after a few minutes. Sona heard the nervousness in Amelia's tone and frowned. Hi, is it a problem? She asked and nearly jumped when they heard Naruto chuckle. It's not so much of a problem for us. It's just that they are extremely curious assholes. Naruto said as he appeared from the leftmost bookcase. Almost like he walked straight out of the shadows again. Amelia did jump and gasped at the small scare. She turned her head to the right to see him. I didn't even sense him. How the hell does he do that? She mentally asked. Naruto smiled and answered her unasked question. We of the Anbu are trained to become insensible and to move from the shadows. As though we are a part of them. Not many can do this, even in our ranks, but I was the best my village has had in nearly a century. He then looked at Sona. What would you have done with the remains of the strays? Sona furrowed her brow in confusion while looking at his eyes. What do you mean, Naruto? Naruto sighed and explained. We shinobi are taught to not only kill, but to loot the corpses for anything that can be of use. Those strays didn't have any gear, but they did have a few other things that can be useful for rituals. Poisons, bones and organs, blood, the list goes on for a little while. He then asked again. What would you have done with them? Sona closed her eyes and rubbed her forehead. Collect them if you can. It would be a good thing to tell the devil race that strays have mystical ingredients in their bodies. Would these also appear in us? She asked after giving him the okay. Naruto hummed and looked up to the ceiling. It's possible, though I am certain only blood would be a decent enough ingredient from you all. The key to them having more ingredients is the fact that they allowed the power to corrupt them to the point that they change. He rubbed his chin for a minute before continuing. It's not something I would tell the rest of the devils about. Unless if you can really trust them, they could try to exterminate you, along with every stray. He said, before turning to leave. I'll collect anything that could be useful. Good evening. He then walked right into the shadows again and disappeared. Amelia sighed and turned to look at Sona once more. That's going to be common with him around, isn't it? Sona nodded and turned her eyes back towards the desk. Naruto's room, 5:30. Naruto sighed as he stopped meditating. It hadn't taken long for him to collect the ingredients from the stray devil corpses, it wasn't even much of a challenge to find which ingredient went to which practice. Some magic requires certain ingredients, but the fact that most here don't know that is vexing. His thought stopped for a little while, and he decided it was time to properly explore the area he now lived in. So, he stood and dressed himself before heading towards the entryway. His senses told him that Emilia, Serafal, Sona and Tsubaki were awake. Tsubaki was heading towards the entrance hall and appeared to be getting ready for something. I suppose I should tell someone that I'll be exploring for a while. Might as well tell the one closest to the entrance. He thought before jumping down from the second-story walkway. His leap and his landing were silent. Not even the air was displaced by his waist cloak and the floor didn't even groan at the sudden shift in weight. He quickly gazed around the entrance hall and spotted Tsubaki putting a different pair of shoes on. She wore an outfit that although he could not recognize, he could easily tell that it was for exercising. She wore a blue track jacket with matching blue track pants that had a black stripe going up the sides. She also wore a dark purple t-shirt, since the jacket wasn't closed, he could easily see it. Her glasses were the same as she always wore and he could sense a small bit of mana holding them in place. Her shoes were standard running shoes with white soles and a light blue material for the main body of them. The laces were dark purple, like her shirt. She did not notice him until he spoke, his voice making her jump slightly and turn to him. I will be heading out to properly map the area. In other words, I will be exploring. Thought I should let someone know. Tsubaki calmed after a few moments and nodded. Very well, just please remember these words. The humans know nothing of the supernatural world. Devils and the like are only myths to them. Most don't even know that magic actually exists. She untensed after saying that before continuing. You will need to hide your tails and ears. Otherwise, questions will be asked. Naruto nodded and closed his eyes for a moment. It took a small amount of time, but his tails disappeared. Followed by his ears. Tsubaki nodded as he opened his eyes again. She could not see it under his sunglasses, but his eyes also fell under a type of illusion. They changed back to blue, or at least apparently. She turned to leave and did not hear him speak. Arigato for letting me know that. He then seemed to disappear by apparently phasing through the floor. Sona's office, 6 o'clock. You're telling me that the Ouroboros dragon goddess told you to take care of her new champion? That she appeared in your office at school just shortly after he did? Do you know how crazy that sounds? So Tan screamed the voice of Serafal Leviathan. Both Sona and Emilia winced while covering their ears to hopefully stop the ringing. After a few minutes of holding her ears and then rubbing her temples, she responded. Hi, Ni-sama. She appeared after I resurrected him and helped heal him somewhat. She continued rubbing her temples, trying to ease the headache that had hit her from Serafal's shout. She seemed to transfer something into him. I can't tell if it was power or something else, but I sensed it when she spoke to me. It was subtle, but she allowed me to sense it. Serafal and Emilia nodded. Though, Emilia was also trying to stop a headache. After a moment, Sona was going to speak again, but was interrupted by Tsubaki walking into the office. Kaichu, Naruto has gone to explore Kuo. I warned him about keeping his talents and extra appendages hidden. Tsubaki said as she stepped up to the desk. Sona looked at her bishop and nodded. Arigato, Tsubaki. Did you also tell him about the other types of magic users that could show up? She asked. At the girl's negative shake of the head, she sighed. We'll get to that later. For now, I'll have my familiar follow him. To make sure nothing untoward happens. Tsubaki nodded and turned to leave. She was somewhat jealous as she had never seen Sona's familiar but cast that feeling aside. Of course, Kaichu. I will be going on my run now, good day. She said as she left the office. Serafal looked at Sona with a twinkle in her eye. Yay, so Tan's calling me. She kept staring at Sona, whose eyebrow twitched. Ni-sama. Sona sighed after a moment. That's not her name. Naruto appeared in an alleyway close to the gate of Kuo Academy. He paused for only a moment, having caught the scent of the young Nekashu through the hazy pollution of modern scents. The smell of exhaust fumes from the vehicles he saw on the street were a bit nauseating to his heightened sense of smell. He grumbled a little and decided to focus on dampening the sense that was aggravating him a bit. After a few moments, he continued walking out of the alley. His first sight of Kuo Academy made him sigh. It was still summer vacation, but he could see a few students and faculty moving on the grounds. Why do I get the feeling that we are going to be stuck there for a while, Kurama? He mentally asked his tenant. The sound of her chuckle from the mindscape made him grimace. Probably because we will be, who knows. He sighed again before he turned to head left. This is going to suck. He whispered as he left the area that held the academy. He may have not minded learning, but he still hated being bored from classwork. As he continued mapping the city, he noticed a few things that made him sigh. The worst was, people were far more mob-like than they should be, far too socially interactive to pay attention to what was going on around them. And another was the amount of sexually explicit interactions and commercials. Or at least he thought they were explicit. Kurama, am I really seeing this? He mentally asked after stopping near a park and seeing 3 teenage men spying on a group of girls that were enjoying a day at the park in summer clothes. Clothes that he could have sworn would be in one of Jiraiya's novels, if not a movie made by the same man. Kurama was silent for a few moments, but responded. "Hi Naruto-kun, please, beat those 3 as soon as you can," she said, with a pleading tone. "They look like they might have some of the Toadman's influence." Naruto nodded, before one of them almost shouted about the amount of oppi he was seeing. No, they're worse. He would later learn that there was the internet as well. It was nearly noon when Naruto stopped exploring by walking in the crowds of the city, instead turning to the rooftops, as shinobi tended to do. Using mana, he influenced people to not even notice him and stayed out of camera view with his own skills. He even released the minor, though taxing, illusion on his new appendages and eyes. He paused on top of the local shopping mall as he finally knew that whoever was following him was a non-threat. Whoever it is needs to learn that completely suppressing their aura is a dead giveaway. She's been at it since 0800. He thought before turning in the direction she was watching from. I was right, female, and those wings look like a crow's. He didn't even bother with waking Kurama up, not enough action for the kitsune to bother with. He raised his right hand and beckoned for the follower to speak. He smirked slightly when she hesitated. Seemingly surprised that he knew she was following, so he spoke to her in a clear and authorities tone. "You have been following me since this morning. I do not know why, but we will speak now." She seemed to blush at his voice, as most women did, and approached after a few moments. "The first thing you should know, miss, is that completely suppressing your aura is a dead giveaway to any censor. They can feel the rift caused by doing so, almost like it's a void of energy. I suggest that when you next do that, to try and only limit the power outage to match your surroundings," he suggested in a cold and chiding type of tone. "However, even that won't stop the best from sensing you." She frowned as she landed, having been following him by flying. He finally took notice of what she looked like. Her hair was long and nearly as black as Sona's, her eyes seemed to glow slightly in a pink and red color, almost turning purple at certain angles. Her outfit was strange, but not something he would glance twice at. She wore black shorts, with small pieces of dark gray armor going down the sides of her legs and also over her crotch and lower abdomen. Her top was more of a bra, but also had the armor pieces covering her upper chest and her back. Pauldrons were draped over her shoulders, though he noticed that they allowed freedom of movement. She also wore a choker, as black as her outfit. Her footwear was just as black and carried shin greaves to protect the lower legs. She also had a pair of bracers, they were the same color as the rest of the armor. Almost like Hanbu gear odd. He mentally concluded. It only took one glance for him to classify her as an assassin-type fighter. He smirked again at that. She knew that he had scoped her out with just a glance, it was something that she hoped to learn how to do. Classifying a fighter with just one glance was something only the most trained or battle-hardened warriors and assassins learned. "I suppose you are wondering why I am following you," she responded after a few minutes, trying to gauge his reaction to her presence. She tried to sense him in that time, but couldn't feel anything different between him and the surrounding area. Her voice sounded cold, yet he could feel a bit of nervousness in it. "Not really," he responded, sounding as though he were bored. His eyes stared directly into hers, picking up a few facts that she was unable to hide in her eyes. "There are many reasons that you could be following me. I just don't really care at the moment." His eyes narrowed slightly, though she couldn't see it. "Ophis, oh, that's the Ouroboros name for now. Definitely not a threat." She seemed to be shocked for a small moment, but regained her composure. He spoke again, leaving her to wonder what he would do, while disappearing by seeming to phase into the ground. "Tell yourself and your mistress what you will. It doesn't matter to me, as we will meet again at some point in time." Her eyes widened at the stunt and the fact that she still couldn't tell if he was gone or not. She looked around quickly. After a few minutes, she took flight, being unable to find him. Not knowing where he went or how. "I need to contact Ofisama," she thought, before her eyes widened again. "Mistress. Does he know who I follow?" she asked herself, before nearly blasting off to get back to the ruined church. Naruto watched as the fallen angel left, having finally been able to know what she was. After she was gone for a few minutes, he stepped out of the wall near the roof access door. Fallen angel, following Ophis, the Ouroboros and a group called the Cows Brigade. He continued to watch the direction that she had disappeared in, for a few moments. He then turned and walked away, in the opposite direction. "This requires more research," he said, before leaping towards the next roof. After a few minutes of leaping from roof to roof, he paused. Turning his head to the right, he saw a sweet shop just below. He also saw the Nico he had met from Ria's Gremory's peerage. "Isn't that the one who is afraid of the sage arts?" Came the voice of Kurama, even though only he could hear it. "Indeed, Kura-chan. The one that we are supposed to help out in order for Sona to have this territory under her complete control." He responded mentally and then grimaced as he remembered the other part of the deal. "As well as the other part, I can't believe that they use arranged marriages like that. It is disgraceful." Kurama hummed in agreement. True, the elemental nations stopped doing that a few decades ago. Even the royalty said no more. She then sent him a mental nudge to speak with the young Nico. "She might be able to give us a proper tour. Though, she doesn't seem talkative." Naruto nodded and leapt to the ground after hiding his kitsune features again. He landed silently, not even getting the attention of those who were walking by, and proceeded to cross the street towards the shop. He read the sign of the shop's name before entering. There were a few differences in the languages of his world in Japan, though it was only the written aspect. Arigato Sweets was written on the sign, or at least, that was what he could catch. The aroma of the shop was strange to him, as he hadn't spent much time in sweet shops before. His heightened sense of smell caught so many scents from the shop that it nearly made his eyes water. The town smells also did this, but it wasn't as bad due to the open air. "Welcome, young man. What can I get for you?" Came the voice of the young shop owner. Naruto guessed that he was in his mid-20s. The man's hair was a light black, while his eyes were a near gold color. His facial features were of a type of aristocrat, while his skin was pale. His voice was lighter than average, and he seemed to prefer speaking softly. Naruto approached the counter, taking a quick sweeping glance around at the products. "Not sure yet, I stepped inside to speak with an acquaintance." He paused after saying that, finally close enough to catch the man's scent. Half human, but the other scent. From the corner of his eye, he saw Koneko turn when she heard his voice. The shop owner nodded before returning to making sweets. "Just holler if you want anything." Naruto nodded as he turned to walk towards Koneko. "Arigato," he said after a few steps. Koneko Taoju sighed lightly as she ate a slice of strawberry cheesecake in her favorite sweets shop. The shop owner had been in business for a few months when she stumbled across it nearly a year before. She knew that the owner was a damper, much like Gasper, though she could tell he was far more used to putting his life on the line than Gasper could. The young bishop of her king was still far too much of a reclusive frightened child. She still grumbled those words privately after spending some time working with said child. Her sigh, however, was for the book she had been absorbed in for the past day. If Nichan didn't really go mad with power, then what happened? She mentally questioned herself. She had already read half of the tome, and the information drew some concern. Though, the info wasn't as concerning as her current thoughts. The door opened after Arigato had placed another slice in front of her and moved back to the counter. The shop didn't normally draw in a lot of customers at this time of day, but some would straggle in at even more odd hours. Her eyes narrowed as the new person spoke, and she turned to see the new queen of Lady Sona's peerage. She also caught the feeling that an alpha predator was inside, though the energy was masked, she could still feel it. Her eyes widened slightly as he turned towards her and approached at a relaxed gait. "Fancy meeting you here, young one." His voice carried across the small distance between them, sounding almost like the promise of honey being delivered at no cost. She wouldn't tell anyone, but her sweet tooth would make her add honey to a glass of milk at times. His voice sounded even better, but a reference was the closest she could get to explaining just how nice it sounded. His words weren't loud, like most people his age were. In fact, only those who were serious in life could match the near silence that he spoke with, people like Sona. Or even Surzich's, when the brother of her king wasn't being his normal cis-con self. She watched as he approached at such a leisurely pace, almost seeming to slow down as he got closer. But then again, time seemed to stall to her senses as he got closer to her. "I hope I am not intruding, but I saw you here whilst exploring the town and decided to stop in," he said, though it took a moment for her to process the words. His power may be matching the surroundings, but Nekashu could still feel the presence of sages. She nodded and returned her attention to her snack, though he could tell that she was nervous. "You are unsettled by my presence," he said after a few minutes, with a sigh. "You need not be so, even if you do not like to talk. I will not attack you." She gazed at him as he sat down across from her. She turned her gaze downwards, not sure why she felt strange from his presence, but she knew that it caused her heart to skip a few beats. "Would it help if I gave you my weapons for this meeting, young one?" She nearly winced at his question, but looked back at him. "No, you don't need to," she said after a few moments, noticing just how relaxed he was. She knew that he wouldn't even need claws to slit her throat, which still made her feel strange, yet it wasn't in a bad way, she decided later. "Very well, young one. Allow me to finally introduce myself. I am Naruto, of the clans Uzumaki and Namikaze." He bowed his head slightly, as was the formal greeting and introduction whilst sitting. She didn't know of those two clans, which took her a moment to see if she remembered those two names, but introduced herself as well. Koneko, of an unknown clan, formerly Shirin, of an unknown clan. I now consider my clan to be Taoju. She didn't know why she had given the name that her sister once called her by, but she had a feeling it was proper. He nodded and turned his gaze to look out the window. And abandoned. That doesn't normally happen, but I suppose that one of only two Nekashu wouldn't be able to learn of her history very easily. His words were spoken as though he were talking to himself, but he did catch her slow nod. They sat there for a while, chatting only a little every few minutes. As the time wore on, Koneko felt more relaxed around him. After an hour, he stood once more. Well, Miss Koneko, this meeting has been pleasant, but I must return to my exploration of this town. He said, turning to leave. Koneko looked up and for a moment, she fought with herself. She then stood as he reached the door to the shop. I'll give you a tour, she said, quickly paying for her snacks, before then following him. I thank you, that would be most helpful. He said and held the door open for her. Guo Mall, 1300 hours. Here is the mall, the town's main shopping center. Koneko said as she finished off the tour for Naruto. They stood on top of the bookstore across from the main mall. Most of the mall was owned by the Gremory family, but more than a few stores were owned by Sona herself, including the one they stood on. I must thank you again, Koneko. You have helped me gain a better understanding of the territory. Naruto said with gratitude before he turned to her. He noticed that she was still slightly distraught, but he could tell that it wasn't so much his presence that caused it. Kurama. Can you catch the reason for her nerves? He mentally asked his tenant. Kurama hummed for a moment, gazing through his eyes to read the energy he was looking at from the Nico. It looks like it is a personal subject as well as the book you gave her. Though, I can't say for sure without getting a better read in person. Kurama replied before thinking for another moment. Maybe you could offer your help in understanding of chakra and the sage arts. After all, that is one of the jobs for Sona to hold this territory. Naruto nodded mentally and turned back in the direction Koneko was looking. He trusted the Yakai's words, though he felt a small bit of caution at all times. She might be right, it'll put me in better standing anyways. He thought after silencing his connection with Kurama. In repayment for this, I would like to offer you something, Koneko. He said after a few moments of thinking, he turned back to the Nico. I offer proper tutoring in the ways of Senjutsu, as well as theory of chakra itself. Koneko stiffened slightly, but turned to him. Will you accept? He asked after a few minutes, though continued with a few more words. You do not need to answer now, but I hope you think about it. He watched her gaze at his face for a few more minutes. Koneko was trying to see if he was telling the truth, though she noticed that reading him was next to impossible. I would like to think about it. She said and nearly sighed in relief at his nod. As you wish. In the meantime, allow me to escort you back to the school. It is the height of rudeness to allow a young lady to walk by herself when she is in thoughts that are so. He paused for a thought on what word he should use. Vexing, to the ability to pay attention to one's surroundings. Koneko nodded after a few more minutes. She turned to the school and leapt from the bookstore's roof. He followed, only a few nanoseconds behind her. Their walk to the school wasn't long, but it was in silence that seemed to stretch out time for the young Nico. She still felt like there was a true predator next to her, yet something else was niggling her senses about him. You do realize that she is torn on what to feel around you, right? Kurama's voice sounded through their bond. He almost chuckled out loud, but responded through the connection. Of course, she feels like I am an alpha predator, yet also feels like I am trying to guard her from something. Kurama huffed. And how the fuck do you know that? He slightly smirked and showed her an image of him tapping his nose. I learned quite a bit more about sense on the field than we took notice of originally. He then stopped as he and Koneko arrived at Kuo Academy. We will converse later, we are being watched. He turned to Koneko and properly bowed to her. I once again thank you, Koneko, for the tour. I hope you have a pleasant day. He then stood and turned slightly to notice Ria's Gremory watching from the old school building he had seen when he was here last. Koneko nodded before she turned to head towards the occult research club. She didn't notice her king watching her with a frown. Sona's Manor Office, June 21, 1430. Sona sighed as she laid her pen down, having just completed glossing over the missive from Lord Lucifer whilst taking notes on everything she could find in it. It wasn't the full document, which would be delivered to her later, so she couldn't read everything she needed about it at that time. This is only the general overview. Seraphil knows that I hate not having the full documents before me. Still, this had to be done quickly. Mother said that Riser-san has been far pushier about the betrothal lately. She thought before her eyes looked up to the office door as it opened. She saw Naruto enter, turned to close the door and then headed towards the bookshelves to the right of the room. She watched as he scoured the shelves and took a few books that were in the history section. She knew which books he had grabbed, knowing the layout of her office as personally as her own room, before he approached a desk near one of the windows on the same side. The books were on the most recent history of the world and of Japan, concerning both the human history and the supernatural. She continued to watch him for a few moments, noticing how quickly he was able to read and take notes on a pad of paper he had pulled from somewhere along with his own pen. She didn't know that he knew her gaze was on him, but after a few minutes she turned back to look over the small missive again. She wouldn't notice until 2 days later that he wouldn't even sleep whilst researching about the history of this world. It would cause her some concern when she did. Sona's office, June 23, 9 o'clock. Naruto sighed as he closed another book on history. He had finally gotten to the point of the First World War in it, not even bothering with the fact that he was slightly tired. "You've been at it for over 3 days, Naruto-kun," Kurama said, in a light scolding tone. "You still aren't recovered enough for such activities. You need to rest more than normal, as not even I can keep your body going after that dimensional hop we were thrown through." Naruto chuckled and stood, after nodding his head. He didn't make it far, as only a few steps later he felt his knees nearly give out. "Alright, you are correct, Kuro-chan. Might as well just crash in the chair, as I doubt my chakra will let me abuse it for energy right now." He heard no reply to his thoughts, as he was too tired to even use the connection properly for mental speech. Kurama was only able to hear the first sentence of his thought, but knew why it closed. She cursed him, but didn't even bother keeping her own end open for him to hear. It was only a few moments later that Naruto fell into a sleep that wouldn't fully do as it was supposed to. 30 minutes later, the office door opened and both Sona and Tsubaki entered the office. Upon noticing Naruto, Tsubaki tensed slightly before she asked her king a question that would make Sona think for a moment. "He's still in here, does he sleep in rooms full of books?" "I did notice that he was here all night yesterday, I'll have to check if he left last night," Sona thought before opened her connection to the barriers of the manor. After a few seconds she sighed and turned to Tsubaki. "He hasn't even slept since he awoke from his coma, only those like Serafo could do that while being in a weakened state." But she could only go for a full 48 hours in such a state. She started to chew on her bottom lip for a moment before speaking again. "That would be all, Tsubaki, I can handle the paperwork for today," she said in a dismissal type of tone before she walked to her desk. Tsubaki nearly froze, but nodded after a moment and turned to leave. She did cast one last glance at the sleeping blonde before she opened the door and left. Sona sat in her chair and opened the folder that contained the papers she would need to get Naruto into the academy she headed. She then sighed after a few minutes of checking over it all. "At least this isn't very difficult," she said before she turned to Naruto and noticed him sleeping in the same chair that he sat in nearly 2 days before. "That reminds me of a few years ago, I was always passing out in our library from overindulging myself in research. I wonder is he like me in that regard?" she thought for a few moments. She twitched slightly in arousal at the thought that he would study so much, as she always valued intellect. She then heard the voice of Kurama through the bond she held with him. "He normally does this for a few weeks straight, while being able to go just as long without the need for sleep that he requires right now." The Kitsune responded to her mental question. "I apologize for intruding your thoughts, but he needs far more rest than he normally does. The jump through dimensions was harder on his body than it should have been," Kurama said before going quiet. Sona thought for a few minutes more before her gaze turned back to the paperwork on her desk. "Does he really spend so much time researching things?" she mentally asked, though she didn't send the question telepathically. She had learned quite a bit about mana, even going through a few ancient tomes about mind-based magic, though there wasn't much knowledge about that. Maybe he knows more about it. I'll have to figure out just how much he knows," she finally thought after a near half hour. She had been thinking about far more than that while still filling out the few papers needed to enroll her new queen piece. She didn't pay enough attention to notice that Naruto had moved to be behind her right shoulder. She nearly jumped when he finally spoke. "Is this my cover?" His question was asked in a nearly cold type of deadpan tone. She turned towards him and he noticed her eyes were widened at the small scare he unintentionally gave her. He sighed slightly, not even making much sound as he did so, before he decided to give her a small piece of advice. "You will need to get used to that, Sona. I was raised in the shadows, trained to fight in war and assassinate. To spy and to steal secrets, as well as artifacts and currency from the enemies of my home. To torture and interrogate information from those who held it, and to trade in knowledge and information that many wouldn't even place in their black books." His words were said in a tone that sounded like a veteran to her, someone who had seen the darkest reaches that sentient beings could delve into. "The shadows are my realm, places to travel through and lie in wait for the perfect moment to strike. To reap their souls before they could even learn about my existence or presence. They are my realm to play in, as well as my most trusted ally." He then turned his gaze to directly stare into her eyes. You must get used to me showing up like this fairly often, as most other modes of transportation are either too noisy or they take too damn long. He turned back to the papers that she had been working on as she thought about his words. Great, he owes you another dance, Kura-chan. You were right, he mentally said to the Kyuubi that normally gambled with Naruto in strange ways to get rid of her boredom. The clone heard his tenet cackle through their own bond and instead focused more on the papers before Sona. Vice President. Okay, he thought after a few moments of reading what she had applied him for. He stopped afterwards and moved to stand before her. I suppose that it will do. As long as I am near you at all times during this, it will make my new job easier. He said before going silent. He stood before the desk for 20 minutes as Sona finished the paperwork and then turned to him. She gazed at his goggled eyes for a few more minutes before she spoke to him. You will be my right hand in both the school we are to attend and in my normal duties concerning the underworld. Tsubaki is my normal secretary in running the academy, though you will be taking her place after being taught how. You may find this a bit more. He raised his hand, stopping her. I know how to run an academy, Sona. I will just need to research more about the subjects that I am expected to attend during the usual school hours. He then sighed again, this time clearly enough for her to catch. And please, don't ever use the word normal, I find it to be a word that defies its own definition. He said, gaining a nod from her, as well as a small smile. She turned back to the papers in front of her, but stopped as she noticed Naruto was still in the chair at the desk he was reading at. She turned back to the one before her and narrowed her eyes before switching between the two for a few moments. After a minute, she noticed the Naruto before her smirk. Mind telling me how there are two of you when I can only sense one? She asked in a slow tone. The Naruto before her chuckled slightly and turned to the blonde who was still asleep at the desk. A special technique the boss mastered a long time ago. Where he is from, he was known as the Walking Army, the Legion of the Forest. For he is many, yet he is also one. The Kage Bunshin technique creates a clone made of chakra and a small piece of his own soul. This makes us, the clones, capable of gathering intelligence for him and giving the memories back when we dispel. The clone sighed for a second. Though, that was only his public persona for our last mission. Sona turned back to the one who was asleep. So, he will know about this paperwork and conversation when he wakes? She asked. At the clone's nod, she asked another question. A small piece of his soul, does that mean that he will gain it back when you are gone? The clone nodded again and she chewed on her lip again slightly. The clone turned back to her and gazed at her face for a moment. It is a type of conjuration, chakra and mana split, memory and mind split, and very minor soul splitting technique. However, it also halves your power by every clone you create normally. The clone then conjured a chair and sat down. The boss, or the creator as some of us will call him, is capable of making us by the thousands, and he won't be winded at all. But, the hop between worlds did far more damage to him than you realize. Right now, he can only make 2 before succumbing to exhaustion, or at least be winded like an average person went running for a few miles. Sona's eyes widened slightly and she stared back at the real Naruto. Thousands. When she heard the clone chuckle, she turned back to him. As I said, a legion. His response almost floored her, but she caught herself enough to return to the pages in front of her and she put them in the folder once more. You said that you have memories, does this mean I could ask a clone about his past? She asked and looked back up at him. The clone seemed to think for a moment and nodded. I see, that might be helpful. She whispered, knowing that the clone could hear her. Tsubaki had only been gone for a few hours before she returned to the library of the manor. When she stepped in again, she noticed Naruto still asleep in the chair he had procured. She then turned her gaze to Sona's desk and stopped. What the hell? She screamed in her own mind. She saw Sona conversing with another Naruto and her king was in thought for a moment before speaking to the awake blonde. Tsubaki turned her head to look at the blonde who was asleep before turning back to the main desk. She paused for a second and then cast her own sense of mana throughout the room. Tsubaki only felt that there was one Naruto in the entire mansion, yet she could clearly see 2. She then heard a chuckle from Sona's desk. You won't be able to sense us, as we are connected to the creator by the small piece of soul that he created us with. We are true clones, and the only way you can tell that we are here is when the boss is far away from us. Naruto's voice said to her from Sona's desk. Sona smirked at her, before bidding her to step forth. What can you tell me, Tsubaki? Tsubaki stepped up to the desk and laid an envelope on the desk. The Phoenix clan has sent us this missive. They are claiming that they will follow Lord Lucifer's decree, but that Riser may dismiss it. She then sighed and opened the folder to the last page. Lady Phoenix also sent a letter. She claims that Ravel has left Riser's peerage and is thinking of coming her for sanctuary. Sona raised an eyebrow and cast her gaze to the clone of her new queen. So, Riser's sister has finally seen the depths of his depravity. She turned back to her bishop. Does Lady Phoenix say anything else? Tsubaki nodded. She says that if Riser breaks this decree, he will be disowned. Lord Phoenix agreed after Lord Lucifer met with him. She then sighed before continuing. His health has taken a drastic turn and removal has been found. Sona frowned before reaching for the folder. She read the letter and then turned the pages to read the entire missive. It's not just that they found him, she said after a few minutes of flipping through the pages. But they found his corpse. She sighed and looked to Naruto's clone. Light magic residue is all that remains in the wound. Headless and without any mana to cast a burning resurrection. His wife and child also suffered, though young Elizabeth was also raped. The clone hummed for a moment before turning to the sleeping Naruto. The clone scoffed and disappeared in a small explosion of smoke. Just enough to see an outline of where the body once was before that too disappeared. The groan was heard from the now awake queen. Are you telling me that you want to offer sanctuary to the sister of the dipshit we must keep away from the town? He asked before standing and turning to them after a yawn. Sona nodded and levitated the folder to him. Ravel is the best of the two remaining children of Clan Phoenix. It is more than likely that she will soon be the heir of the Earl seat of Phoenix. She then opened a drawer and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. Pulling 3 glasses to her, she filled them with a small amount and then grabbed a bottle of something else that Naruto hadn't seen before and poured it into the glasses as well. She then stirred them using mana and levitated 2 of the glasses to her peerage members. Tsubaki took a sip and sighed. This brightens my day a little. She said and sat in the second chair before Sona's desk. Naruto took a taste from his own glass, hummed in appreciation, and then stepped to the chair that his clone disappeared from. He quickly read through the 30-page missive and then the letter. You do realize that it may be necessary for us to go to their home. If this Lord Phoenix is actually sick, then we cannot leave poison out of the equation. If their usual is to burn poison out of their system much like a phoenix, then there are only 1 or 2 poisonous plants that can do this type of damage. Sona raised her eyebrow again before casting her eyes upwards to the ceiling. Or holy water, though that would require a light-based person to use properly. Naruto raised his own eyebrow but said nothing as Sona continued thinking for a moment. We will go to the ancestral Phoenix Manor and see what we can find there. If Riser tries to break the decree, we may have to fight our way out of there. Sona said after turning her gaze back to them. Finish your drinks and then alert Momo, Tsubaki. We leave in 30 minutes. Tsubaki nodded and then emptied her glass by consuming it quickly. She then stood and left the library to find the other newest member of Sona's peerage. Naruto watched the glass that Tsubaki left behind and sighed before throwing his own drink down his throat in the same way. I'll be ready in a moment. He said before seeming to disappear from before Sona's desk. Sona watched as he vanished and turned to look at the glass and folder he left on her desk. She then sighed and looked at her own glass of vodka and whiskey. This will burn, she said before draining her own glass as quickly as the other 2 did before leaving. She then stood with a minor grimace and made her way to the door. Sona's manor entrance hall, 12:45. Naruto stood in the entrance hall, waiting for the others to arrive. His outfit was the same that he had worn for the last 2 days, but his weapon had changed. He now wore a 6-foot-long greatsword on his back, single-edged, and nearly half a foot from spine to edge. It was a bright blue color, with the edge being darker, and seemed to make one feel as though ice were about to encase those it would cut. It's been a while since you last used the sword, Naruto-kun. Kurama said through the mind link they shared. As I recall, it was when a certain bird gave you problems. She finished speaking, and Naruto smirked at her words. He chuckled as he recalled the summon he faced when Jiraiya was on one of his intelligence-gathering episodes. Hi, a damn phoenix too. He heard her chuckle as well before she went silent. He knew she was replaying that battle in her mind and recalled how many times he had cut it down before using the sword he had resting on his right shoulder. The collateral damage from that fight was massive, but nowhere near the amount of his fight with Kagaya or even Madara. He straightened his back more as he heard the others arrive. He noticed Sona pause for a moment and blush as she looked at his sword. She can sense its ability. Well then, definitely an ice mage. He thought and heard Kurama hum in agreement. Momo was staring at his sword before she looked away blushing slightly. She stayed silent and fidgeted a little while his tails were glanced at every few seconds. He heard his tenna chuckle at that before he looked at Tsubaki with a glance. She wore her usual summer outfit, a business-like suit that was gray with a lighter gray skirt that had black stripes. A light pink button-up shirt with a black tie, her usual glasses, white socks and gray shoes. But what really caught his eye was the long naginata she carried. Its long shaft was a bright red with gold inlays that painted a near waterfall-like image running from the blade to the pommel of the shaft. The blade was a bit larger than the usual naginata he had seen and had bright silver kanji along it. A quick reading of them gave him the meaning of them on the weapon. Unbreakable, never dull, and mana distribution, all arrayed like a seal around the kanji for fire. No, that won't work. Unless if his slaves are weak to the fire element. He looked directly into Tsubaki's eyes and spoke. I commend your choice of weapon, but the element in its use will not help you. The other three raised an eyebrow, or at least all but Momo. She only looked confused and then noticed Tsubaki carrying the naginata. Her eyes widened slightly before turning back to Naruto. What do you mean, Naruto? Sona asked before turning her gaze to the naginata that rested in Tsubaki's hand. She looked closely at the weapon and could not see anything wrong with it. Tsubaki also looked at him before he explained. The blade has silver kanji that paint an elemental seal into the weapon. It is fire-based, so if she pushes mana through it, the blade will light on fire. The silver gives it a small advantage of use against undead, while turning the flames to be a bit more divine against them. Though it will only work on the undead and against those who are cursed with lycanthrope. He sighed before turning to Sona. Its divine aspect won't work against us unless it was cooled with holy water. And it is old, not carrying much power on its own, and not young enough to have a connection to the church you have told me about. It will not break or get dull, but the elemental aspect of it will not work against the Phoenix clan. Tsubaki grimaced and turned to look away from him for a moment while Sona nodded with a thoughtful mien in her eyes. I can offer you one that may work against them should a fight break out. Though it won't last forever. He said, gaining the attention of Tsubaki once more. Sona raised an eyebrow again and looked at Tsubaki before turning back to him. If we are forced to fight, then by all means do so. Though I must ask about that blade you have now. Why does it feel like a blizzard is about to happen just from looking at it? Naruto smirked before taking the blade from his shoulder and placing it before him. The edge facing to his left and appearing to darken to a near midnight blue. This sword is an ancient relic made from adamantium and cooled in the coldest springs of the land of snow. Made for a Ronin who had saved the country long ago from a great beast that nearly destroyed the land with fire. He sighed slightly and cast his eyes upon the edge. His glasses were missing right then, and the three ladies noticed his eyes brighten slightly at the explanation. Enchanted with the ancient powers of ice spirits, it will freeze all that it slices. Even the flames of Uchiha Madara would not be able to stop it, and he was the best fire user in the elemental nations. His majestic flame destroyer was capable of igniting a quarter of the world, turning part of the planet into the deepest and hottest pits of Makai. His eyes then turned up to them and they noticed a glimmer of mania in them. He was a tough bitch due to his power, skill, and brilliance on the battlefield. Momo gulped and asked the question all three of them had on their minds. Did you fight him? He smiled and his eyes seemed to cast a brighter glance of insanity. Even if it was only temporary. Hi, killing him was a pain. But the fight made me feel alive in a way that only the end of a planet can make you feel. When he fully resurrected and absorbed the Shinju he easily reached God class. Kagaya was more powerful than him, but she wasn't a real fighter. Momo gulped again and looked to Sona, who sighed. Enough, we leave now. The king then cast her circle to transport them to the underworld. The underworld, Phoenix Manor Gate, 1300 hours. They arrived at the gates to Phoenix Manor, though many would claim that it is a castle. The four approached the gate, noticing that many devils were there. Naruto had already placed the sword on his shoulder again and glanced around the courtyard. His eyes narrowed and his ears twitched at the sounds of music and conversation reaching across it. Of course, a party is going on. Tsubaki said, with sarcasm clearly being broadcast through her voice. Naruto sighed after her words. Chapter end. Alright, that's it for today's video guys. Let me know in the comments section how was the story and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Peace out.